I was prepared to, teach language poets this week, um, and I was going to look at certain poems. I haven't taught Perelman's chronic meanings before, but after the weekend, I felt like I needed to pick something, some kind of context for this class, some way of, addressing the thing that happened.
Yes.
And I brought chronic meanings to class, and it was really moving and powerful to have it in the classroom to talk about the sentences that we had.
How did the students respond? And did you make the direct connection to the tragedy in Pittsburgh, or did you just let it be a conversation about what Perlman is doing and it got there by itself?
I kind of touched on the fact that I want to find a way to respond or find some way of talking about it. And it certainly, before long, while we were talking about the poem, we started talking about, the sentences that we were, we had in our minds and were choking on, or just like stopping ourselves in, or just the sense that no language is enough to say the thing that, these obvious cliched things that you just stop yourself in the middle of. And
Yeah.
it was a powerful moment. I was very grateful to have that poem around. And another piece that I brought to the classroom, and you mentioned this book, Charles Bernstein's Near Miss book.
Yeah.
So I brought that, and I took out a few things from here, particularly his piece called Concentration, which responded to a law that was being passed in Poland around the discourse around the Holocaust, like what's okay to say in Poland about it and what isn't.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like an amazing take on an investigation of language, essentially what David was referring to as a production of language. So Bernstein was, in that piece, he's dealing with how language around, what Polish government says is okay to say, is not to say, how it is being produced, and
Yeah.
just like gathering it all for an investigation. It was
I
powerful.
have a question for you, Jake, and then I know you have to go, so I'm going to ask Erica to pick up a second response to this question, and then Anna. So there's a lot of in the popular discourse. There's a lot of ethically charged discussion about the badness. Sorry for that word, of silence. Right, and it's true. I mean, it's not a dumb thing to say. It's a good thing to say, but there are problems with it. And it's something like this: whatever it is, I think one of the rabbis in Pittsburgh said this. Whatever it is that we need to fight, it's one. Yes, we need to fight hatred. We need to fight racist hatred, but we also need to fight silence. We can't be silent in response. Then you have something like some of the strategies of Harriet Mullen, and here in Perlman's Chronic Meaning, you have deliberate silence. You have or as Baraka says in his poem Incident, we have no words. I mean, there comes a point where silence is actually the most ethical response, because as a teacher, for instance, it allows you to turn to the students and say, okay, how would you fill out that line? So I think silence gets complicated here. I want to ask you to comment on that, and then I know you have to go, and we'll turn to Erica.
I guess the right response to your question would be like silence, but because I guess I'm a teacher, it's really hard to do that.
Hard to be silent.
Right. Well, I guess I would just say, like, there's a difference between silence and silence, and a big difference between a silence that's framed by an act of, like, being active in your silence. The silence as an action, as a performance, as a response, visible and intense and uncomfortable and emotional and heartbroken kind of a silence.
Yes.
Rather than
silence as evidence that you're listening, right?
Yes,
like,
rather than
that
oblivious, kind of.
the poem Ellipsis that Amber Rose,
Yes,
that many of us have read in Sleeping with the Dictionary, but Amber Rose brought it back.
right,
The silence there is the silence of, like, do you hear yourself talking? Do
right.
you hear yourself using these lines? Do I hear my mind finishing that sentence? Do I hear, like, what's so
Mhm.
bad about what's being not said, etc.? So in conversation, you want to know that someone's listening, and the only way to listen is to be silent. The opposite of silence is bullshit, filling in, stepping on lines, and completing someone else's sentences. You have to go, but thank you, Jake. And please, we saw Anna and I hung out with your students by Skype recently, and they're adorable. Can I say that? Am I allowed to say that?
You had
They're
the same question last
adorable.
week.
What did
You had
I
the same
say?
question last week.
And thanks, Anna. And
Over 5 minutes, he's gonna be late.
he's got to go. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're great, and please convey to them that we say hello and that we hope they feel safe. Thanks, Jake. All right. Erica, do you want to go from here on that, and then we'll turn to Anna?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a couple of things. One is the question of intentionality, like whether you're being silent because you're choosing to be silent or being silenced, which I think are very different things.
Yes.
And the second thing that I'm thinking about is the difference between silence in writing and silence in speech.
Yeah. Can you make that distinction?
So I think that I'm thinking about chronic meaning and the way that Perelman deals with the sense of having no words by putting words down on the page, and how, he's both silent and not silent at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that poem to be really, really moving because of the way that he does that. And in speech, I don't think that can work the same way. Like, I'm thinking about my own class where, I'm teaching a class on education in America, which it's an odd time
Tiny
to
little
be teaching a
topic.
class like that.
Tiny topic.
Huh?
Tiny little topic.
Yeah, tiny. And, there have been moments where I just haven't known what to do or what to say. And that's what I say to my students. And it feels like it's a really odd feeling because I feel guilty. Like I'm not supposed to be out of words. But I think that sometimes you are, and I think that writing is one way to negotiate that. I'm not sure if I'm making much sense.
You are making a ton of sense. I mean, I think this is really a reductive way of thinking about poetic history, recent history, but there was a big fork in the road at a certain point, I'd say around 1958, 1962, where one part of American poetry, coming out of the modernist tradition, went to, if I speak, I will be therapeutically enabling myself to say something honest about myself, and you can read and learn about me, and maybe that'll help you, but certainly helps me therapeutically. And then there was, for lack of a better phrase, the so-called New American Poetry, which was really actively trying to resist that confessional mode, right? And winds up being accused, goes back to what we said earlier, accused of inhumanity and distance and irony, but ends up producing things like Chronic Meanings or Ellipsis, right? Those are not confessional poems. Ray Armantrout is pulling language from the environment. She's not speaking about herself necessarily, and yet they're very powerful. Anna, what I'm going to do is take the liberty of playing the first minute or so of Chronic Meanings, and then you can respond to that following the conversation. And then, Lily, we won't take any more calls. We'll do final words after that. And so here's Chronic Meanings.
Chronic Meanings for Lee Hickman. The single fact is matter. 5 words can say only. Black sky at night, reasonably. I am the irrational residue. Blown up chain link fence. Next morning, stronger than ever. Midnight, the pain is almost. The train seems practically expressive. A story familiar as a society has broken into bands. The 19th century was sure characters in the withering capital. The heroic figure straddled the clouds, enveloped the tallest, tens of thousands of drops. The monster struggled with Milton. On our wedding night, the sorrow burned deeper than. Grimly, I pursued what violence? A trap.
Anna?
I just find this poem so moving. But one thing that came up in the forums this week that I thought that made me consider this poem in a way that I hadn't before was, I suppose, because I've always considered this poem in the ways that it expresses the abrupt loss of life, right? The way that life is
Discontinuity.
right.
Being cut off.
In the ways that the only 5 words per line, and there's clearly a sort of a second half to each one of these sentences, in many cases. But someone in the forums wrote that the poem, in a way, is just as much about life as it is about death, because there is still a speaker, or many speakers probably, right? And the fact that there are speakers and the fact that there are sentences that are spoken, even if they are cut off, means something.
Yeah.
And that made me consider this poem, especially given what's happened this week and this year and the last couple of years in, human history, in a way that I hadn't before. It made me feel newly attentive to the sentences and not just to what might have been had they been finished. I think you can hold both of those equally when you read that poem.
And even when you can complete the sentence in your head, it's better than his having done it for you. Even
Sure.
when you can do it pretty definitively.
Sure.
Midnight, the pain is almost... I mean, I really think that word probably was unbearable.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to bear unbearability there, just a little bit,
Yeah.
right, in putting that word out. So, I mean, poetry can be that powerful. That's an empathetic thing. And we don't even know where that little bit of discourse came from. It might not have been Lee, because Lee was actually not, Lee Hickman was not that far along in the disease at that point to possibly be the author of that line. But the fact is there's so much pain in so many places.
Certainly.